What's up, guys? Welcome to True Crime Queen. My name is Ginger. Listener discretion is advised. The dark nature of the show is not suitable for young ears or those sensitive to graphic material. But without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everyone. I know that this is going to be a tough couple weeks for everybody, but that's why I'm not going to bullshit around a lot. I'm going to jump right into it, all right? So let's do it. This is Washington State's most prolific serial killer. He's charged with officially 49 murders and confessed to 71 plus. And even Ted Bundy wanted in on all the attention this Green River Killer was getting at the time, while earning the highest amount of serial killings that the United States has seen yet. This is Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Much like the victims of Robert Yates, the victims of the Green River Killer, who is believed to be Gary Ridgway, were more often than not local prostitutes who we already know really lead a pretty high-risk life. However, a grip of the Green River Killer's victims were also really young girls, sometimes as young as 15 years old. It was obviously easiest for him to attain these women and girls simply because of their high-risk lifestyles, or in some cases, with the younger girls, high-risk choices like hitchhiking. I mean, it was the 80s. To make that more interesting, and to my own surprise, and maybe yours too, Gary Ridgway was actually a father himself, even before he started killing young girls. And Ridgway even says in video-recorded confession tapes how he was focused more on getting these victims into his car simply just to kill, rather than the act of sexual intercourse in the process. And he speaks with a almost routine about it. It's almost like he's a hunter, and these women are just like this season's trophies. He talks about hiding their bodies underneath the river rocks like it's just some normal everyday job or like task that he's given. Oddly enough, there are even a few women that he dated throughout this time period and actually managed to get married in the duration of his killing spree. That marriage actually led to the amount of signature remains that were being discovered in the area to decline so much that the task force searching for the media-dubbed Green River Killer would completely disband after 8 straight years of consistent unsolved murders. It was finally the advancement in forensic science and sheer stupidity of Gary Ridgway that would eventually reveal his identity to everyone. And what have we learned about the United States' most prolific serial killer since we've identified him? Well, he not surprisingly had a somewhat shitty childhood, but it's not the worst I've ever heard of, though. Gary Leon Ridgway was born way back in February of 1948, so that makes him currently 71. And I say currently because, spoiler alert, this POS has not croaked yet, but it shouldn't be too much longer now that coronavirus is sweeping into Washington State. No, I'm kidding, but honestly, prison life can't be too easy when you're 71, and he's not getting out anytime soon, rest assured. I'm going to throw out some trigger warnings now because there's a lot of rape and obviously ending in murder, and only one incident with a young child, though I will give another heads up just before it. Gary was originally born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he was the middle child between 2 other boys in the Ridgway family. They moved from Utah to Washington when Gary was about 11 years old. And neighbors there said that they could sometimes hear the fights that Gary's parents would get into because of how loud they would get. Friends and family recall that Gary's 2 brothers were tall, social, and played a lot of different sports, while Gary was a bit stockier and he was quiet and preferred sports like wrestling. His mother is described as very domineering and loud. She was said to dress rather provocatively for a mother of 3 young boys. It's sort of funny because in one of the documentaries I watched, a couple was being interviewed and the woman started talking about Ridgway's mom, but then her husband kept continuing to cut in and add little tidbits yeah, she wore really low-cut shirts and really tight shorts. And it was just really obvious that the dude was checking her out all those years, the way that, he was recalling the mother. I don't know, it cracked me up anyways. But Gary's mom has apparently got it going on. So, it was said that his father actually worked as a city bus driver, often driving the routes that went through the areas of town known as the Strip along the South Pacific Highway. Every city has that one street that you go to for, that purpose. But Gary recalled that his father would often come home griping about the prostitutes he would see out on the streets, and he talks trash about them like they're the scum of the earth or something. Gary also said that even though his father would speak really badly of the escorts, he did in fact seek out their services as well. Gary said he was even with him as a young child one time that his father had done this. Now, whether or not any of that is actually true, Gary attributes this to his predisposed, finger quotes, feelings regarding women who work on the strip, which is also that they're basically pieces of trash. Gary has also admitted in confession tapes that he had a bit of an issue wetting the bed while growing up. Even clear up into his teenage years, he told his psychiatrist during his interviews that his mother would get super mad about the pee accidents and put Gary in the bathtub and proceed to thoroughly wash his privates every time he had an accident. He also thinks that these intense forms of punishment and touching would later contribute to his rather violent sexual fantasies that sometimes included his mother. And he says it didn't help by the way that she dressed. I can't talk shit about a mom who puts effort into her looks, but I can say something about one that thinks washing the genitalia of their 13-year-old boy who is still wetting the bed, that's a pretty major red flag, yo. Gary Ridgway was also said to have dyslexia, and that's the learning disorder that makes reading really difficult. And because of this, he was actually held back a grade or two during his high school years. He started tearing up on camera, actually, when he spoke about the times that his parents were fighting about putting Gary into special education because he was so behind in school. And I think this is probably about the time that Gary needed some major intervention or like therapy, because his first instance of violence occurs when he's about 14 or 15 years old. And here's where I'm going to give you the trigger warning, because it does involve a child and it's not cute. Go ahead and skip 20 seconds to avoid it if necessary. Okay, so Gary alleges that he led a 6-year-old boy from his own neighborhood into a bushy area and then proceeded to stab this poor kid in the rib cage, actually puncturing his liver. Why? Well, who cares why? You couldn't tell me a good enough reason to do that shit to a kid. But Gary says in his confession tapes that even when the child asked Gary, "Why did you do this to me?" Gary says he replied, "Because I wanted to see how it felt to kill someone." And then apparently he laughed while wiping the blood off the blade onto the little kid's shirt and then walked away, leaving this kid to die in the bushes. Thankfully, he somehow managed to survive after receiving about 100 stitches, and unfortunately, Gary was never charged or even punished for this. I'm not even totally sure the child knew who Gary was. He explains to the therapist he only hurt that particular child because he found him the most vulnerable, as he put it. The boy was actually alone playing cowboys and Indians when Gary led him away. Ridgway didn't graduate until the age of 20, actually, because he was held back, and almost immediately joined the United States Navy, and he ended up marrying his first wife, Claudia, while he was stationed in San Diego, California. He ended up serving on the supply ships during the time of Vietnam, though he never actually saw any combat. A former friend he served on the Navy ship with, however, talks about the fact that Gary would often solicit the services of prostitutes while staying in foreign countries. In his confession tapes, he admits that he in fact contracted a couple STDs from not using protection with those women, and then proceeded to blame them for being dirty. Just another reason why he hates hookers. But not enough to stay away from them, though. So you can tell this guy is a total asshat. So there's a couple different descriptions of why Gary and his first wife actually got divorced only after a few years together. But the gist is that there was adultery on both parts. We know Gary was using hookers, but one of the documentary shows I watched said that he came home from serving on the ship to find that his first wife was actually being pimped out by 2 men that had moved in with her while he was on leave. Now, honestly, I'm not sure if that's true, because all the other documentaries decided not to go into detail other than claims of adultery. However, in 1972-ish, Gary Ridgway begins working in Kenworth Trucks, where he tapes off and paints semi-trucks. He actually ends up working at this business for 30 years, and his coworkers there describe Gary as nice, but not so nice that you'd go have a beer with him after work, is what they said. He is a little on the strange side, and not long after, Gary would meet his second wife, and he gets married again in 1973. They even go on to have a child together within a couple years, and that's a son named Matthew, who was born in 1975. His wife, Marcia, claims that Gary became more religious during that time together and, oddly enough, more violent. She claims he put her in chokeholds many times, and he was very sexually active, trying to get it in like 4 or 5 times a day, she said, a lot of the time while they were in public places. It almost sounds to me like a bit of an addiction, though. She finally took her son Matthew and left Gary's ass in like 1981 after 8 years together. And my understanding is that Gary would get to visit with his son on the weekends. And one time when his son was 7 years old, he brought him along in his truck to seek out a local prostitute. He says they then drove to a wooded area. Both Gary and the woman walked out of sight, leaving little Matthew in the truck alone. When Gary returned to the truck without the woman, the son asked where the lady went, and Gary told him that the lady lives nearby and she just decided to walk home. And that, my friends, is most likely one of the times he had killed one of his earliest victims. Gary would actually end up getting his first arrest for soliciting to an undercover cop who happened to be posing as a prostitute. In May of 1982, he was charged, fined, photographed, and then released. His mugshot photo can be found on Google pretty easily, and you can tell he's not like the scariest looking guy. Practically looks like every other young dad in the 80s, sideburns and a mustache. It was only 3 months after this incident that Gary would actually be stopped again with a prostitute. But by this time, only one female body had been found and nothing to link it to Gary or anyone else until more would be found pretty soon after. Gary claims that he didn't start picking up hookers and killing them until after his second wife divorced him. He said he was so angry with her and he took it out on any prostitute willing to get into his car. He didn't even care if they had sex, he just wanted to kill them. The first 5 victims were all discovered over the summer of 1982, within weeks of each other. A couple of the women had been floating down the river, others were put with rocks holding them down under. One was found along the sandbanks while securing the scene of the other bodies. With all 5 victims being found in close proximity to the Green River near Kent, Washington, the media immediately saw it as the dumping grounds of what they considered the Green River Killer. And Gary Ridgway did not get to pick his title like BTK. It was something dubbed solely in relation to the location of the first bodies being found. He was also referred to as the Riverman in various other articles. The first body found in the river was on July 15th of 1982, and it was that of 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield, who was reported as missing just a week before that. Her cause of death was found to be strangulation, and 2 boys walking across a bridge at the end of their day noticed a small body stuck under a few rocks in the water below the bridge. About a month later, the body of 23-year-old Deborah Bonner was found discovered by a man who found her floating along the river he was rafting. 3 days after that, on August 15th, 1982, the bodies of 2 more women would be found in the water on the Green River, but both appeared to be strangled as well, and they were actually found to have river rocks inserted into their vaginas. While securing the crime scene, another young female body was discovered, making the total 3 in just 1 day. The 5th body was found in the wooded area near SeaTac Airport, and she was also a known prostitute, like a few of the others, and she also appears to have been strangled. The bodies of young women would continue to be found at a rate of 4 per month, and the people were definitely becoming aware because all these bodies were being reported so often. With the media announcing the discovery of so many bodies in such a short amount of time, the amount of female bodies popping up in various areas north of Seattle are beginning to back up detectives trying to link the cases together, and they're struggling to organize the literally thousands of tips that are pouring in from like all corners of Washington at this point. They even got a state-of-the-art computer system to help them log everything in and make sense of all these bodies being found. Kent County detectives even notified the newly developed Department of Behavioral Science at the FBI and requested a serial profile be made off the information found from the bodies being discovered. Famed profiler Bob Keppel replied with their suspect was likely a white male, mid-30s, might still live with his parents, and might try to implicate himself into the investigation. And obviously that doesn't really help detectives too much. It's pretty vague, but that isn't until a local taxi driver decides to come forward in hopes that he has some information that could help with the case. This taxi driver's name is Melvin Foster, and he happens to drive taxi in and around Seattle, mostly at night, and often interacts with many of the women who have gone missing or have been found dead. He points the finger at someone the cops don't seem very interested in. However, they do become more suspicious of this Melvin guy. He's officially questioned and is actually put on 24-hour surveillance for 3 months straight after he fails a polygraph. And because he seems to fit the bill pretty well, until they realize that 4 more women have actually gone missing in that time, and it couldn't have been Melvin. Now, he's obviously not in jail as the Green River Killer, but you would have to listen to how this weirdo answers a local news reporter after it became public that he was one of the task force prime suspects.
Did you kill all those women or what?
No, but I wish I did. I wish I did know who did. Because, I'd put a stop to him.
Excuse me, sir? What the actual fuck did you just say? Like, honestly, I don't blame the police one bit for taking the time to watch this guy for a little bit, but he was obviously an oddity. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. The lead detective on the case, Dave Reichart, actually received a bunch of backlash for focusing so hard on someone they never ended up charging. Even the FBI had to tell Reichart that Melvin Foster just wasn't the man they were searching for. Police gather similar information from those women who actually worked the strip, and many of them are claiming to have seen some of the missing or dead women last getting into a maroon-colored Ford truck with a camper on the back of it. One of these girls was 18-year-old Maria Malvar, and her own boyfriend actually followed this maroon truck after witnessing his now missing girlfriend get into it. At the time, he actually lost the truck but managed to find it again while searching the area again later with his girlfriend's father. They even got the police to come question the owner of the truck about the men's claims that he was last seen with Maria in his truck. However, when the police questioned who turns out to be Gary Leon Ridgway, he simply denied having anyone in his home and or knowing the girl. Furthermore, his home is never searched and her family never sees this poor girl alive again. And what's really fucked up is if whatever cop questioning Gary that day would have just taken the time to press him a little bit harder, it's possible 30 plus women might still be alive today. This little hiccup didn't really stop Gary a friggin' bit though. Gary actually lived in a pretty nice neighborhood at the time in his life. His neighbors said he seemed rather normal and they would see him out doing yard work from time to time. One particular neighbor said that the only thing she didn't like about him was the fact that he would wait in the road for everyone to pass before backing his big ol' red truck up into his driveway, which was more annoying than anything, but she never considered why he might be doing it. Like most men, it just seems like it would be easier to leave the next day, and she probably never gave it another thought. Turns out he was probably stashing a lot of hookers' bodies in his truck because he would often bring them to his house and kill them. While working what was probably the toughest case in his entire career, the lead detective gets a rather interesting letter from Ted Bundy, actually, who at the time was waiting in line for his own execution in Florida. And he's all, hey guys, like, as you know, I'm a pretty big killer myself, and I also happen to grow up and murder young ladies in Washington. I'm like kind of a big deal, and I think I can help you. I actually think this was Ted just super jelly that someone is more prolific or better at evading police than him, but also he was probably just stalling his execution in reality. So detectives are like, okay, let's go see what he has to say, but we'll make sure we ask the questions that he can also answer, maybe truthfully, with his handful of unsolved murders. So they fly down to Florida for 2 days, rack his brain, just like in Mindhunters. I bet if they get into like a 3rd or 4th season, they'll probably reenact this time in true crime history. Anywhooser, Ted Bundy does happen to suggest a few things that detectives are able to confirm. One of them was that the man they were searching for was most definitely returning to the site of disposed bodies, and if they were able to, they should stake a new discovery out and see if the killer returns within days of the dumping. They actually went back and tried to do this. However, with the media being so up the task force's ass over everything, over any time they made an appearance on the highway, it was just impossible to keep a disposed body under wraps long enough to bait out the killer. Another idea that Bundy tossed around was the fact that their suspect was most likely a sex addict, which turns out to be true, and they might be able to easily catch him frequenting public porn theaters and sex stores, which we all know Seattle has no shortcomings with, and no, that was not supposed to be a joke, but it is now. In 1984, a woman named Rebecca had actually managed to escape from a man who she says had attempted to strangle her while they were doing the no pants dance. She says he got aggressive with her after he claims she bit him, which isn't true, but that's when he started choking her. And he actually let her go at some point during the struggle, and she was able to grab her purse and dip the fuck out of there. However, she initially didn't go to police until the amount of women disappearing became, even striking to her. The woman who had escaped and another prostitute Gary was actually stopped with before were able to identify him by his photograph on record, and both confirmed that he was the last person some of these women had been seen with as well as attacking Rebecca. So this allows police to take a little harder look into Ridgway. When police bring him in to talk about Rebecca, he claims that he did choke her, and that pretty much makes him now one of the prime suspects in the Green River killings. So Gary Ridgway would often convince women getting into his truck that he was a good, non-threatening guy, often showing them pictures of his son or having some of his small toys in the truck for them to see and feel eased by. Usually after and sometimes during sex, he would instigate a fight while being behind them, and then he would begin choking them with his bare hands and then later learn to use a makeshift garrote. Sometimes this would take place in his maroon truck's attached camper, and other times in his actual home. He would then dispose of his victims first in the Green River and then later to various areas around the Seattle-Tacoma area, often in groups of 3 and sometimes being posed very oddly. He would occasionally move the remains to throw police off his trail, but at the same time often revisiting his sites to use their bodies once more for sexual gratification, post-mortem obviously. He admitted on video that he would later have to start semi-burying them to resist his own urges to continue having sex with their bodies after death, which is just fucking gross. And at this point, there's been a total of 36 women found so far, making it the absolute largest serial murder case Washington, or the entire United States actually, had ever seen at this point. Gary ended up meeting a woman later, who becomes his third wife actually. In 1985, Gary attended a single parents dance where he met a woman named Judith. They actually hit things off great, and she moved into his neighborhood home rather quickly. You can see her in a few of the documentaries that have been done, but she always talks about how he was kind to her and how much they enjoyed each other. She didn't seem to mind all the sex he was interested in having, actually finding it romantic. Just a couple years into their dating life, the Green River Task Force would actually decide to confront Gary about the killings, this time with a search of his home and work site. Judith was absolutely blindsided when detectives began asking her questions about Gary that she had never considered before, because she said that she was unaware of the local serial killings of prostitutes and runaways because she just didn't watch the news. She mentions to police that they often go biking and sometimes they have sex in public areas of town, which actually ended up being, unbeknownst to her, places that bodies were being found, and that sometimes Gary would go into work early and sometimes he would stay late, but not super often, not often enough for her to suspect anything. So whether it was just because she didn't want to believe it or she really was just unaware, police suspect that she was actually sleeping in the very same bed that Gary might have murdered over 30 women in. So Ridgway's hair and saliva samples are taken and put into safekeeping for further testing, while nothing was found in Gary's home or work area that could physically connect him to any of the known murders at the time. So they once again had to let him off the hook. Gary and Judith continued on with their relationship, probably stronger now that he felt a little victorious against police. They were said to get married in his neighbor's backyard in a small ceremony with a few of their closer friends, and one of Gary's coworkers was his best man, which that guy even said was a request he never thought Gary would ask him. However, from the sounds of it, being with her actually slowed down the number of female bodies being found dramatically. So much so that after Gary actually married this woman officially in 1988, the Green River Task Force would end up disbanding just 2 years later in 1990. The case wasn't closed, but without more information coming in, they'd just have to wait for forensic testing to become better before detectives could move the case along further. In 1990, the only DNA testing would require a large amount of any sample, and it would destroy it in the process, and it was very expensive to have done. So with the little evidence that they were able to get from the earliest bodies that were found, they decided to hold off on testing and wait for more options. There was only so much DNA found because most of these bodies were found in skeletal condition, and they weren't able to get any DNA samples from them. The original detectives on the case would actually end up waiting an entire 11 years before being able to match their tiny bit of DNA evidence to hopefully someone that was already in the system's database. When they were notified that a match was found, the lead detective actually called it before they opened the envelope containing Ridgway's identity. This was the last piece of the puzzle that that Detective Reichert needed to take down the man he suspected of the murders. DNA testing confirms the semen found in 4 of the suspected Green River killings tied him to possibly all the unsolved murders in the case. When police finally arrest Gary on November 30th of 2001, with the DNA evidence connecting him to the 4 first-degree aggravated murders, they meet him outside his work, and he's apparently like, "Oh, okay," and went right along with them. No fighting, no arguing, no defensiveness, not a damn word. And why is this? He's probably guilty of those 4 murders. He doesn't have the presence of mind to attempt to react any other way, in my opinion. I think if he was smarter, I think he would have considered being more defensive at least, saying something like, you got the wrong guy, or like anything. It wasn't until his attorney, Anthony Savage, made the defense that Ridgway doesn't dispute his relations with the women that he was charged with the murder of. That doesn't mean that he killed them, because remember, most of them were prostitutes. Further testing that was done before the trial actually added 3 more women to the list of victims connecting Gary Ridgway. When these one-of-a-kind paint chips were discovered on some of the bodies of unsolved Green River cases, as well as Ridgway's clothes and personal belongings, these paint chips are supposed to only be made by the employer that he's at, so they can now connect him to 7 of the 48 unsolved murders, which is good, but not good enough. Washington state prosecutors would take a bit of time to weigh the pros and cons of throwing the death penalty at him. They absolutely wanted to, but they decided that it was better to offer a plea deal where they might be able to connect more of the unsolved murders back to Gary and close more of the cases for almost 50 other women they couldn't tie Ridgway to. This entire process took over 5 months, which included the videotaping of his confessions, on top of field trips to the locations of suspected victims to confirm that he had actually committed the murders he was willing to plead guilty to. Investigators were able to find the remains of 3 additional women while allowing Gary to show them a few of the areas he frequently disposed women in. He was able to make a list of 41 other women that he claims to have killed that they had originally suspected were Green River killings. Almost 2 years after his 2001 arrest, he would plead guilty to the first-degree aggravated murder of each of the 48 women named in court, one right after the other. Now think about that. That's like listing off 2 entire classrooms of children. That's insane. He also admitted that he had decided to move the bodies of 2 of these suspected women across state lines over to Oregon to confuse police at the time. He also agreed to the prosecutor's request that he would agree to plead guilty to any and all future King County cases where his confession could match their evidence. They weren't trying to tie him to any of the cases he didn't actually do, after all. So even if he said he killed someone, they wouldn't charge him with it until they could confirm that he actually did. At the time of his confessions, he would admit that he honestly killed so many women that he lost track, but claims he killed about 71 people, but can't remember all their names and locations. So in the meantime, as more remains are being discovered, his list of convictions will continue to add up. In the interview tapes that have been released, you can sometimes find Detective Reichert getting Gary Ridgway to slip up and say something, very similar to how in the show Mindhunters, the younger detective is always getting in trouble for using inappropriate language about the victim in his attempts to question the murderers. On December 18, 2003, a judge officially sentences Gary Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences with no future possibility of parole, and then an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence on every single count. So an extra 480 years in addition to 48 life sentences. Safe to say he's never getting out, thankfully. It was 10 years after the original guilty plea to 48 counts of murder that the 49th would be added. Gary Ridgway pled guilty to the murder of Becky Marrero on February 18th of 2011 after hikers found her skull, and returned DNA analysis confirmed Ridgway's 2001 confession of her murder. So that meme about serial killers having these cool sounding names is totally true. We really do need to start calling them by like their sexually transmitted diseases or embarrassing features, like Gary Gonorrhea Ridgway, the bedwetting poodle lover / necro romantic. I don't know, something like that. Some people out here on the interwebs apparently don't think that Gary Ridgway is the official Green River killer. Their argument is that he's not intelligent enough to kill 49 women, let alone nearly twice that he confessed to. On top of that, out of all those women that they have recovered, why would DNA only link him to 4 of the 49, but it's now actually 7 out of 49? Based on mainly what they consider circumstantial evidence and not enough DNA to connect only less than a tenth of his suspected victims. Search Gary Ridgway on Reddit and read through the thread if you're interested, though. But during my research, I found that another man was actually at one point in the investigation suspected as the Green River killer, and even had his house searched. 3 years after, in 1989, that suspect had gone on to sue 3 separate media outlets who had reported his name to the public before he was officially cleared as a suspect. And this dude was able to receive $30,000 in a defamation suit because of the whole ordeal. On the other hand, there is a much more interesting rabbit hole that I ended up going down about another suspect, one that actually seems to fit the bill a little better than Gary Ridgway in some ways. Now remember, DNA has only linked Gary to 7 of the 49, and he's officially convicted of, and we are to believe that the 42 other cases were verified by investigators per Gary's confession and a reasonable amount of evidence to prove his confession. But without that DNA evidence, it's awfully hard to definitively say that Gary Ridgway is in fact responsible for the nearly 71 murders that he's tried to confess to. So now hear me out. But I think it's a given that Gary did kill at least 7 of these women. However, I can also believe that there is a possibility that there was someone else out there at the time also murdering women. I mean, is that so crazy to believe? I mean, we are talking the Pacific Northwest, and as we all know, is for whatever reason the common home to serial killers. So I'm just going to elaborate real quick on someone who we could probably talk about in a whole nother episode by itself. This William J. Stevens II guy was also one of the Green River Task Force prime suspects for a period of time, and he would come to their attention only after someone calls him out after seeing a television special. Green River detectives would actually be more interested when they come to find that this guy has quite the array of police equipment, including a car, uniforms, and a bunch of handguns. They think he could possibly be posing as someone as an authority figure to these vulnerable women, and the interesting snuff film type of photography that they found in his home only furthered that suspicion. He was also rather uncooperative as a suspect in general, but when his stepbrother was able to come in and clear some of his alibis for some of the dates that these women went missing, the police decided to focus their sights back onto Gary Ridgway. This Bill Stevens II's stepbrother has since come out and says it's very possible his now deceased brother William could be responsible for some of the cases that Gary's been convicted of. He has a lot of points, and I think they leave a little bit of room for discussion as to if Gary Ridgway really is responsible for every single count he pled guilty to. It has been said that Gary seemed to also be sort of jelly of Ted Bundy in a way, and how everyone knew of him, but no one was gawking over the more prolific serial killer of the Green River. Detective Reichert would say it was almost like a numbers game to Ridgway, and that the title being the best serial killer was one that was important to him. To me, Gary Ridgway's intelligence level doesn't really matter too much. Sure, he might not be able to lie very well, but I do think he's capable of appearing trustworthy, and he does manage to continue killing even after police have looked into him multiple times, which was either Ridgway's pure luck or just really bad incompetence on the task force's part, because honestly, he does not seem smart enough to methodically or strategically evade police for almost 20 years. The police wouldn't have enough hard evidence that would outweigh their opinions that he was just too stupid to commit those crimes until DNA could definitively prove this bedwetting moron was able to kill at least 7 women right under their noses. The only reason the DNA was able to be scraped from a couple of the victims is simply because he was weird enough to shove those rocks into their vaginas, almost like sealing his DNA inside them, and because they were found before major decomposition did occur to their bodies, they were able to scrape it off their bodies, just proving that Gary Leon Ridgway is a fucking idiot. So that's Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The Green River Killer ? I guess. But I just want to remind everybody that next week is my 10th episode. So after the 10th episode, I'm actually going to take a little break. My kids are on a 6-week quarantine right now, so I need to take some intentional time with them. They're usually at school when I'm able to work on this podcast, but since they're home, I can't just like ignore them. So I'll let you know next week when I plan to be back sometime in April. I'm just going to take a couple weeks off. And I just wanted to give you a heads up for that now, all right? Well, and thanks for listening. I just wanted to remind everybody to wash your hands, check on your elderly, make sure they have all the things they need so they don't have to go out and compromise their immunity any more than it already has been. Be good to each other, you guys. Stay safe out there. And we'll see you back next week. So that's what I got for you. I hope you enjoyed my rendition of this story, and if so, please tell all your creepy friends about it. You can find the sources I used for the episode in its description. You can follow my Instagram account at True Crime Queen for some laughs if you need a little pick-me-up after all that dark shit. Feel free to leave an honest review on iTunes, or maybe even consider clicking the link in the description to make a small donation to my equipment fund so I can keep making you guys some killer-ass content. See what I did there? I know. Alright, bye!